Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to get started.
We're going to have that.
The JCC Senior Program is so thrilled to be part of this, and we're just so glad to host you. We're very lucky to have a very important program here. Thanks to Deborah from the Dallas Jewish Historical Society, and Zane from Dallas Jewish Funerals. And I'm going to turn over the 7,000 microphones to both of you. Okay.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I'm sure it's
Very
well
well.
for
Need
me.
some help here.
Yeah. That's what all my life is about, is needing help to do things. Just for information, I had rotator cuff surgery, so that's why I'm wearing this thing. I also want to thank you for coming. The Dallas Jewish Historical Society is so happy to host this event. And your speakers today, Mitzner and Michael B. Cohen, are full of information, and I think you're really going to enjoy what they have to say. And yeah, thank you.
All right, I'll kick it off real quick. I'll just echo the thanks that have been given. I appreciate our relationship with the Dallas Historical Society, our relationship with the J. You know, the J is near and dear to probably most everyone's hearts in here. Probably all of us had kids or yourselves grew up here going to camp. And which, speaking of which, if anyone in here has a connection, I need to talk to you about my son working in summer camp. Someone, who was it that was mentioned earlier? I think it was Kathy. I need to find.
I'll hook
Yeah,
you
so-
up, don't worry.
Okay. That was a sidebar, sorry.
Did you say help at summer camp? Yes.
I'm really honored to have these two gentlemen here. A lot of what we do, at Dallas Jewish Funerals, is we encourage families to plan ahead. I'll talk a little bit more, later on. But planning to us is not just about planning your death. There's a whole world in planning that really needs to occur, and oftentimes it doesn't. And that's where it's important for us to have gentlemen like Michael and like Avi to partner with and to put these events together, because we want to make sure you're educated and you understand everything that's involved in the planning process. When death occurs, and even before death, there's a lot that goes that's in place, and unfortunately, if you don't have your ducks in a row, it can really cause a lot of headache to those that you leave behind. So with that said, we'll start off with Mr. Cohen, who is our wonderful elder care attorney, and he is very knowledgeable, followed by Avi, and Avi is very humble, so he will not give himself props, but Avi has a very strong background, not just from in the Jewish world, but he went to law school. So when he talks about the ethical wills and the Jewish perspective, he's very knowledgeable. And Avi's about to finish rabbinical school, so pretty soon it's going to be Rabbi Mitzner. So that's a huge accomplishment. Very well educated gentleman, just like Mr. Cohen is. So with that said, I'll turn it over.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you very much. I appreciate it. One of the things that I think about, there's a lot of confusion about different types of wills. I think of the last will and testament, which most of you all have heard of, most of you. I hope you have. Living wills and ethical wills, which is the topic here today. But a lot of times there's connection. In a will, a lot of times, first of all, those who don't know, an ethical will is basically kind of telling your story of what's important to you, what your values are. Just think of it as like a letter to your children or grandchildren, or it could be oral, like the Dallas Jewish Historical Society has, which basically tells your biography. In effect, it's a form of a ethical will. Anyway, but a lot of times people try to have those values even in their wills. So I'm just going to tell you a couple of, Obviously, people often say, have charitable planning. Well, that tells you something right there. They think it's a good thing to give to charity. But sometimes there's other types of values. I joked with my daughter when she was a freshman. I said, don't worry, if Mommy and I die in a common accident, your college educations will be taken care of. She said, okay, Daddy, I know you, there's always a little catch. I said, well, there is this one minor condition. All you have to do to get those funds is maintain a 3.8 GPA for 3 consecutive semesters. So I'm promoting education. But it could be anything else. Like I think of another case where a lady, the client, felt strongly about not having her family members have tattoos. Okay, so what did she have in her trust within her will? You have trust, and there's trust within your will, you have trust within your trust. Anyway, so she said, you know, I think of our body as something that was God-given, and if you mark that body, then you're doing something basically defamatory. So, as a result, if any beneficiary of mine has a tattoo, at the time of my passing, you're disinherited. Okay, and this is being tested by the trustee. The trustee will not be compensated if you allow that tattoo. You'll have X amount of months, I think it's 6 months or 9 months, to go to Dr. Tattoo Off or somebody else. Paid political announcement. And then, and if the trustee will not get compensation, there's a thing called trust protectors or trust advisors. So the trust protector will double check on the trustee. And if the trustee doesn't make sure that they don't have that tattoo, then they will not get compensated under the terms of their estate planning documents. So what that means is the promotion of values that we think that no tattoos culturally, we think that's bad against her religion. By the way, she didn't have to be Jewish. I know, of course, under Rabbi Mitzner will tell you more about that than I. In any event, that's an idea that you can say whatever you want. Some people say, okay, if you have a certain amount of degrees, you'll get money quicker. Or if you do have financial success, well, get things quicker. So anyway, you're promoting what your values may be in a will, in a last will and testament, or in a trust. A lot of people have trust as opposed to wills. A living will, most people know what a living will is. If they don't know, a living will is, I'm going to be kind of crude and say it was the pull the plug instrument. You know, you're saying, look, if I'm going to die within 6 months, even with medical assistance, basically don't use heroic measures and let me die as gently as possible. Or if I'm in an irreversible condition, let's say I'm just in a persistent vegetative state, don't let me stay alive. If I have no quality of life, let me die as gently as possible. Remember, throughout history, people want to die as gently as possible. And I could go into, that's why they had the guillotine, I'm sorry to be crude again, or other forms of, now we have the, injection. Why? We want to die as gently as possible. So throughout history, that's been the case. Now there are different types of living wills. There are Jehovah's Witnesses. So the state of Texas has their own language, which is what most people use. But there are different religious types as well. Jehovah's Witnesses have living wills, spinning of the blood. So sometimes you do that. There are Jewish living wills. I want to be buried as quickly as possible in a pine box, etc., etc. Halakhic law. Then there's Catholic living wills. I had a guy one time, I had a client came in with his priest. This is a real story. And I said, there are Jehovah's Witness living wills, there are Jewish living wills, and there are Catholic living wills. He said, there's Catholic living wills? I said, yeah. He said, can you run one off and read it to me? I said, okay. So I get one and I said, okay, we believe in the sanctity of life and We want to have, these stations, and we believe in all that's under Catholicism. I said, but then I got my glasses, and I said, but most importantly, I would like to inflict upon my heirs as much guilt as humanly possible. I said,
Jewish?
well, I told him, I said, this is based, it shows you Catholicism is based on Judaic law.
Just as much guilt, absolutely.
So you can have different types of living wills, although most people use statutory language. You could add to the statutory language. So if you don't, especially like during COVID, there's a lot of people who are concerned about different things like respirators and things like that. So we had a lot of special language in connection with the end of life. And sometimes we have personal care plans on how do you want to be treated during life. Okay, so I want to stay at home as long as possible, but if I have to, can no longer stay at home, I want to stay with my kids, but if their spouse has a problem with that, then I just don't want to go into a star-shaped facility because all the help will congregate in the middle. And when I die, I want to be buried in my white satin dress with my boots on, and on my tombstone say, "Wind beneath my wings." Okay, that's a natural case. Another one was a engineer. He said, okay, my wake, I want these people to speak. And then I want these African-American gospel singers to sing these particular songs, but not to be paid more than X dollars. And I'm going to be buried in my Under Armour sweats under a live oak tree near Tyler, Texas. I was looking at one last night. He says, I do not want to stay at home. I do not want my husband making decisions. He can't even determine when somebody has a common cold. I want to go to, I like to go to museums, but not to row. I don't know why she said that, but that's what she said. Anyway, she said, and I want to be out in the park, but not when there's mosquitoes. Anyway, you can basically get as much detail as you want on personal care plans. But the ethical will, notwithstanding there's connections here between ethical wills and the other two documents I mentioned, although generally you think of it as different. The ethical will, you're stating your values, what's important to you. So when you think about what happens when you die, I mean, most people think about their assets, transferring of assets. But do you think that was going to be more important than maybe words that you may say that was most important to you during your lifetime? What was your values? What was the most important thing? What was the most important event in your life? What do you think is there any regrets that you have? Is there anything you would like to teach your children or grandchildren that they can learn from your mistakes? Is there anything that you think that you want to ask for forgiveness? You think of the high holidays and asking for forgiveness. Is there someone you want to forgive? Or you want to be forgiven from? Well, in any event, so you could, I wrote an article on 30 questions you could do for an ethical will. So you could have, of course it's not limited to 30 questions, but there's so many different things that you can think of, whatever is important to you that you would like to pass on. And by the way, it doesn't have to be written and you don't need an attorney. It could be oral. That's the importance of the oral histories of the Historical Society. And that those who are interested in that, I implore you to talk with the appropriate people, Deborah, because really you are doing, and ethical wills are based on Judaic history. Remember, Jacob gave his blessing to say I want to be buried in Canaan, Israel. I don't want to be buried in Egypt. He gave his blessings to his children. Jesus gave to his disciples, he gave blessings. So it's not, this is going back a long time. Remember, women didn't have property either. So, but they wanted to pass on to their families what was important to them. What is important to them? What are the values? Is there certain traditions? We have certain traditions. And I think at Passover, at our house, we have somebody sign a Haggadah every year. So we can see who had it for the last 20, 30 years. But there might be something that people might like or do differently, and that's different. You know, Historical Society, I remember Deborah, one of the initial meetings, you had all sorts of different things, and basically it was things that you're reminded of that were kind of historical in Dallas origin traditions, and basically that's kind of you're remembering what was important to you, and you can pass on those stories to others. And so basically an ethical will is something that you pass on. Your words may be more important than your money. I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Michael. That's going to be tough to follow. I'll first start off by saying, you know, I didn't know much about living wills, which you mentioned as one of the 3 forms of wills. And my mother passed just a little over a year ago, and she lived in New York, and my sister and I were scrambling around. She was in the hospital, and you know, the doctor made it clear to us that she wasn't going to recover. And we're scrambling around. We knew she had a plot, but that's all that we knew. And we threw her apartment upside down, trying to find some documents to lead us around. We called her attorney, and you know, he just wasn't that quick in getting back to us, and he had these documents and we had no idea. And you know, in the Jewish tradition, everything goes very quickly. So she passed on Wednesday, April 27th, and she was buried on Thursday, April 28th. And it was on Friday, April 29th, when we got all the documents from the lawyer. And in it was her living will. And I'd heard of living wills before. I'd never seen one. And we were relieved to find out, and I think we knew, you know, my mother was an Orthodox Jew. She raised us Orthodox. I'm conservative right now. But I knew generally what she wanted, and I was very relieved to find out that we did things the way she wanted, even though I didn't have that piece of paper until after the fact. But it was something that really was on our mind. The only thing that we couldn't do is get the specific rabbi she wanted, and we honestly had no idea. And we had to call the rabbi afterwards. This is, unfortunately, when we're talking about general planning, my mother had dementia for the last 7-8 years of her life. And dementia causes you to give up on a lot of things, and she had given up. She hadn't gone to a synagogue for much of that time, and you know, COVID was in there as well. And because she had moved away from where she raised us, we didn't know where she was associated with. We were calling shuls, couldn't find one. But everything, thankfully, was done as she would have, as she wanted, with the exception of the specific rabbi, which we did not know until after the fact. So, thinking about ethical wills for a moment, and it's funny that Michael mentioned that you have at your Seder somebody sign the Haggadah every year that is passed on to them, and it's the Haggadah that almost most typifies an ethical will. So the Haggadah, it means the telling, and it comes from the Torah. The Torah says, "V'higada televin," how you should tell your son or your children. Ba'avor zeh asa Hashem li b'tzeitim miMitzrayim. For this reason, it was that God took me out of Egypt. And we do this telling every Passover, not because, partially because we're retelling the story, but we're doing it because ba'avor zeh. in order for this reason, God didn't take us out of Egypt for nothing. God took us out for a reason. And the reason are the underpinnings of Judaism, to spread the word, if you want, of Judaism. I think it's 36 times in the Torah. The Torah tells us that there's such and such that we need to do. And why do we need to do it? Because you were slaves in the land of Egypt. So the story of the Israelites leaving Egypt is supposed to lead to ethical conclusions, right? It's not merely a story, it's a story that has ethical implications throughout the story. It's for that, because of these things, because of my Judaism, that God took our ancestors out of Egypt. And really, one of the best Siddarim I was ever at was the second Seder at a friend's house a number of years ago. And our host, before Pesach started, she sent around an email, said, "We're going to go through the Haggadah quickly, but we're not going to spend time on the Haggadah because you all did it last night. What I want you to do is, we're all Jews. We're all Jews. And Jews, unfortunately, we've been in this country and been expelled, we've been in that country and we've been expelled, and we've been everywhere and we've been expelled. And so we all have a story of how we ended up here. That's not simply, well, I've been here since my father Abraham. So I want you all to come prepared with the story of how your family got here." And it was one of the most moving Siddarim that I've ever been at. And I remember telling the story of my grandfather's nephew. So my grandfather was born in Warsaw, and his family is all from Warsaw. And he managed to get to the United States before the war. He had a nephew who was not able to, ended up running around Europe, all of Europe throughout the war, and then even ended up in a Soviet prison for a while. And when he was released from the prison, my grandfather sponsored him to come to the United States. And he wrote a book. It's called Nisim All Around Me, Miracles All Around Me. And it gave me an opportunity to read his book. And his book was his story, but his book was all the things that he learned from life, and he learned from his story. And the faith that he had in God because of all the miracles that happened to him through his story. And it occurred to me then that really we're great as a Jewish people of telling our original story, the Haggadah, and reading from the Torah, and all of it is very important. And that is our meta story. That is where we come from. But we do need to develop really a more systematized way of saying, no, every family, every generation, it's up to you to tell your story. And your story, as Michael was mentioning, is part and parcel of your ethical will. Your story and your values that led you through life, those are the things that we need to pass on to our children, more so than the will and testament. It's important. You don't want your children fighting over your possessions. You certainly don't want the government getting it, telling you who gets it, right? But really, the more important legacies that we leave are our stories and the values that we learn from our stories in life. And those are the things that we really need to be passing on to our children. This session is called the Dor Vador, which of course it's a very common saying in Judaism, but it's exactly what it means. Passing it from generation to generation, passing our stories, our values, and the things that we learn as we go through life. And those are really the most important things that we can pass along to our children.
Thank you, Avi. Thank you. Everyone hear me right? I'm gonna sidebar real quick. I kind of like to do that. Because maybe I have ADHD, I don't know. But Michael, you mentioned about the mosquitoes in the park. Something I would like to say is they're also to have somewhat be realistic, you know, and have realistic expectations. It reminds me of a story. I won't mention which cemetery or, you know, too many details, but had a woman that we buried her husband, and she kept calling me and telling me that people were stealing the flowers that she was leaving for her loved one, and that she wanted me to take care of it with the cemetery. So, you know, I know all the cemeteries around here really well and have a good relationship with them, and so, long story short, we set up a deer camera, a deer camera, you know, on a tree. You know, because we were going to catch the person that was stealing her flowers. It was squirrels, and the squirrels were coming in, grabbing the flowers, running off with them. So I was thinking, okay, you know, I'll let her know, show her a little video clip, and then she'd be like, oh, okay. No, she wanted us to set traps up in the entire cemetery and remove all the squirrels. And you can imagine that that's probably impossible, you know, unless there was like an electric fence, you know, put up, and, you know, or some kind of trap. And so it just kind of reminded me that, you know, there's certain things that probably are not realistic, you know, you may want to think about, you know, in your requests, and that was one of them. So what I want to talk about, I'll keep it brief, is how we kind of come into play in this big picture, is that oftentimes families will look at us as, oh, I don't want to talk to the death guy, you know, I don't want to talk about funerals. And so oftentimes you'll go and you'll meet with Michael, you'll meet with your rabbi or with Avi, and you'll put those plans in place, but oh, we don't want to plan our funeral, right? Because we talk about it, we're going to die. And so we don't do that. And oftentimes a lot of this trickles into the funeral side, because we deal with situations where let's talk about, which I'll give a plug, we're doing a presentation this fall about cremation, and we're going to have a panel of rabbis up here to discuss, you know, why it's not part of Jewish religion and culture to cremate, but we do still see that. You know, we're about 20% cremation in the Jewish community, but I'm not here to discuss, you know, to get into that topic right now, because that's a whole other can of worms. But we've had situations where, you know, dad wanted to be cremated. He didn't document it anywhere. He didn't have any living will. He didn't have a agent of final disposition on file, which is important. And the family came in, and one of the children knew dad wanted to be cremated, but one of the brothers from Israel, who's a rabbi, was very adamantly opposed. And it turned into a legal battle. 2 weeks later, we ended up burying dad, but just a whole lot of unnecessary additional grief and money spent, and just a lot of stuff that could have been prevented if things were done ahead of time. You know, we also see a lot of heirship issues when it comes to cemetery plots. Who legally can be buried at the plots, who can't. Again, if it's not in the will, if it's not written down and documented legally, you know, then it defaults to cemetery law. It defaults to, you know, Avi mentioned you don't want the government to get involved, and a lot of that ends up happening even on our side. And we will stand out of the way until you clean up your house, so to speak, because we're not going to get involved when it comes to a legal issue. In addition to that, planning for your funeral is essential. You don't want your kids to sit in that room with us and answer all those difficult questions and make all those decisions and turn it into a business transaction. You know, that's the last day that you want to deal with business, right? We want to focus on you spending time with your family. Let us deal with the logistics of the back end. We don't want to be on a conference table going over contracts and collecting money and dealing with a lot of of those tough questions when you're grieving, when your children are grieving. So there's a lot of benefits in the planning process. And another challenge that we see, and a lot of implications that comes with, is if many of you may not know this, and this is sort of an education piece that we try to talk about, is that just because you have a plot, a cemetery plot at Sparkman Hillcrest or at Westland, does not mean that that's who you have to call when you pass away, that you have to use that funeral home. A lot of families don't understand that that cemetery is not even part of Sparkman Hillcrest. It's a completely separate business entity, and any cemetery for that matter. And oftentimes I get families that will come to me and say, gosh, I wish I would have known that we could have used you instead of going to Sparkman Hillcrest, I'll give my own plug, they're about 30-40% more expensive. And at the end of the day, Jewish tradition, your funeral is held at the synagogue and graveside, one or the other, or a combination of both. So there isn't a convenience factor. There isn't any benefit you're getting from going there other than you're going to spend significantly more money. And I would like to think, as a Jewish organization, of being Jewish and most of my staff being Jewish, we're a lot more plugged into the community and have a much better sense of how to take care of you. And from a financial perspective, families get shell-shocked because they end up sitting over there and seeing the bill and feel like they have no other options. And that's not fair, to put on your family either. Another thing is when you check into hospice or different places like that, they're going to ask you, or your family members, do you have plans in place? Well, oftentimes families and people will buy your plots, and you say, "Oh, yep, we're done." No, there's a whole other, set of tasks and processes that need to be put in place specifically with the funeral home, because we have to figure out who's going to pick you up, who's going to take care of you. Do you want the Hever Kadisha to be involved? And many may not know what the Hever Kadisha is, depending on how observant you are. Do you want a shomer there to be with you and sit with you from time we have you into our care until burial? All these questions come up, and while some of these aren't necessarily legal, they still sort of pile on when death occurs if families don't know the answer, if they don't know what your wishes were. And so this is all very relevant, and that's why we try and do these educational seminars to bring different people together that makes sense. So that's, I don't really have a whole lot more to say about that, but what I do encourage you is, whether you meet with myself or any of my staff, I've got Logan in the back. She grew up here. She's a member of Emmanuel. She definitely understands, Jewish history. Eileen is also very well involved. I strongly encourage you, and they're going to go around and pass out some information. We have a seminar coming up in the next, I think it's next week or the week after, La Hacienda Ranch. If you haven't done any funeral planning and you want more information, come. We'll feed you and give you all the information you need to know about funeral planning and arrangements. But we do encourage you to meet with one of us. If you haven't put together any of your wills, if you have more questions about, from Avi, from a religious perspective, please set time up to meet with us, because that's what we're here for. And we want to make sure at the end of the day, when you're dealing with arguably the worst day of your life, or your children are dealing with the worst days of their lives, that you have all your ducks in a row. I guess you're not dealing with it if you're dead, but your spouse, especially the ladies in here. Men, you'll end up going first, so I'm really talking to the ladies. Anyway, thank you very much for coming, and we want to open it up now to questions, because I'm sure you have a lot of questions. I'll come around the room and hand the microphone. Or my lovely assistant, we'll
This is Jenny from Dallas.
Yes, Jenny. Hi, Jenny.
Getting ready for the coronation.
All right, so any questions, please shoot away, and we would love to answer any questions you have.
It's not a question, but when my parents retired, they attended a meeting similar to this, and they were told The greatest gift you can leave your children is to have everything in order. And that's really something that we should all remember and live by.
I don't think any one of us up here would disagree, or anyone that's been through that process would disagree with that.
The term living will is a little bit confusing because it's had to do with the end of life,
Right.
but they call it living will.
Yeah, I know,
Oh, could you,
as opposed to a dead will.
whatever.
Yeah, no, that's just what it's called. A lot of people think of, a lot of people think of living trust. That is, in Inter Vivos, living trust is a living trust. So a lot of people think, oh, a living trust is like a living will. No, living will is what it's actually called a directive physicians in Texas. I direct doctor, and the old ones back in the 90s would specifically say, I direct doctor, all right, don't keep me alive artificially, basically, breathing machines, etc. But the law has evolved. You'd rather have them talk, you can talk to the doctor, but you'd rather have, sometimes you'd like your family involved. So I tell a story about a living will. Now, you know how doctors have lawyer jokes? This is my lawyer having a doctor joke. All right. This is the doctor who had his medicine bag, stethoscope, and he dies, he goes to heaven and sees St. Peter at the pearly gates.
He's not Jewish.
Yeah, not Jewish. This is, most of my clients happen to be not be Jewish.
The non-Jewish section.
Right. Yeah, it's smart, but they have special thing. He goes to St. Peter, and he said, hey, I'm a doctor, let me in. St. Peter said, well, look, doctor, there's a line of people, you're going to have to get to the back of the line like everybody else. So the doctor goes to the back of the line. And this other guy, also with his stethoscope and his medicine bag, and he goes up, and St. Peter lets him right in. And the doctor comes to the back of the line, and he goes to St. Peter, why'd you let that guy in and you didn't let me in? He said, no, that's just God playing doctor again. So do you want your doctor to make the decision, or do you want your family to be involved? Okay. Living will. Directive to physicians.
Good point. I like that. I'm scared.
So true. Me and my wife talked a little bit about ethical wills. To leave something for our children, how we think we should live an ethical, honest, good life, etc. And after a while I said, okay, I'll write something. And I started down writing an ethical will. I thought it would be 3-4 pages on white paper. How to be honest, live a good life, be helpful, etc. And as I told the history of the family, how they came over as immigrants, and about our careers, what's happened in our lives. I've had 3 distinct careers. My wife has her career, etc. It morphed into a book that I self-published. And I didn't realize till I started reading that. Because we're always looking and thinking about what are we going to do today, what are we going to do tomorrow, when we're young, what profession do we go into. I put in there how we happened to meet and get married. We just celebrated our 61st wedding anniversary. She has put up with me for a long time. I always add that. So it morphed into a book that I self-published, entitled it, I started to say, I didn't realize how lucky I have been. The family life as a kid and everything that happened, we take things for granted and we're always looking ahead at what we got to do. And I entitled it, Just Call Me Mr. Lucky, an ethical will entwined in an autobiography. And in it,
I've got a signed copy.
that's right. I have 10 obvious truths, things we all know, and I'm not going to go into it, and I don't even remember all of them now, but I do remember the first one, and I think it's so important that we don't realize sometimes, and it is that no one is totally self-sufficient. We are so dependent on others, and we don't realize it. The clothes we wear, the food we eat, everything. People think that they're independent, but We're not. We're a community, the whole world.
Well,
You know, I want to say that when you do an ethical will, it's not just a little bitty, as you said, you start writing it. And he said, oh, I need to edit this. And you're going to go over and over and over because it takes a lot of thinking, just like you did when you wrote your book. Because the more you get into it, it's going to say, you have to really think. You have to really think. And so I applaud you for spending the time and energy, because it's not only good for your family, but you know what? It's good for you too. It may make you have a better quality of life as well. And you don't have to be elderly to do it. You could start writing something when you're young, or have an oral history when you're young. You could have a recording. There's no magic to it. But I think it's important when you have a self-reflection that it's important not only for you, your children, and generations in the future.
I did have to talk to the family to keep the facts straight. I mean, this is just an autobiography, and you forget a lot.
When Chuck tells us that you can't do it alone, right? So I'll say that part of the way we figure out our ethics and our values is by talking to people and sometimes arguing with them. And I've had the pleasure of having Chuck in Torah study class where he offers challenges. And so sometimes having other people is just, so you can sharpen your thoughts together and you can learn from one another and really, refine what your values are or be changed.
I've been very fortunate. One of my daughters gave me a book, and two of my grandchildren gave me a book. And it's called Want to Know More About My Grandfather. And the book's about that thick. Each page has different questions. And it interested me as I'm reading through it and trying to fill out answers to the questions. Some things I never would have thought of. Like, who outside of your parents and your grandparents most influenced your life? What did they do to influence your life? What are you proudest of you've done in your life? They didn't use the word ashamed, but a synonym for ashamed. What in your life are you most sorry for? And you go, and then also you got to do it as a child, as an adult. And there's so many questions that you would not even think to put in. So as I'm filling it out, I'm glad that Chuck said what he said. I type with 2 index fingers, but maybe it's something I should put on paper so I can hand out to the 8 grandchildren and all my kids and sons and daughters.
So get busy and do it.
I'll tell you, some of those questions, you really got to delve deep to be willing to answer it.
I'll tell you, there are services online.
Right.
We discovered this when my father-in-law was in the hospital, dying, and we signed him up with this service online that every week sent him questions to answer. He would type the answer, and it puts together, it's both the story of your life and through the story what you've learned through life, and it puts together a book.
And what's the website? What is it?
I don't recall the service.
I
don't
either.
I'm
doing
it
now.
You're doing it now, that's wonderful. And it's work, but anything worth it requires some work.
And at the end, they get all the weekly things and put it in a book.
Right.
And then my daughter-in-law gave it for my birthday, and then it'd go to all the children, this book, all that we said over the years. They ask you questions and you answer them.
Yeah, exactly how it works, and they put it all together in a coherent fashion, and they know what questions to ask to elicit responses to really get you to tell your story and to elicit your values from you. And it really is a wonderful tool. Joe, if you remember the name of
I don't right now.
For me, it was like 4 or 5 years ago that we
Oh,
decided
no, I'm
to-
doing
We
it
said it's
now.
story
Right.
worth.
Say it again.
Story worth
Story worth?
is one of them, yes.
Okay,
And
thanks.
what's good about it is exactly what you said. You only get one question a week. I mean,
Right.
you really have time. And it's a much more palatable thing than sitting down with this huge project in front of you.
Exactly.
Oh, are you kidding? I'm the bullhorn of the J.
So what's important about it is that it guides your thinking. You don't even have to answer every question because there might be a week you don't like that question, or you might not want to tell your kids the answer. But it's palatable. You can take it at your own speed, and at the end, it's put together into a beautiful. You don't have to think of laying out your beginning, middle, and end. Very important.
I wrote an article on 30 different questions, and I just put it into 30 questions, because there's so many different things that you could ask to think about.
And how do we access that?
Well, yeah, just give me your email address or something like that, or actually it's gonna be, my article will be published on our newsletter next week.
Oh, good.
So if you're interested, just let me know your email address, but that's not, I mean, that's just, yeah.
Michael, if you would send it to J. Dallas Senior's Facebook page, or I'll give you my email.
Okay.
I will make sure that it's put on our senior Facebook page.
So basically, it just gives you things to think about, like development, and thinking about, and you write your own things.
A suggestion, just the period between death and burial. My husband's family in New Orleans, rather than have a shomer, the family would take turns all night together sitting with the body. And so when my father passed, the grandchildren did this, and it was so meaningful to them in groups. So nobody was alone with the body, but in groups, and they'd sat and talked about him and spent the whole night and day. And I recommend, if it's possible, that people consider doing that.
Wow.
I think that's amazing.
That was Eric Pessin. That was Eric Pessin.
I just wonder, have you noticed in the past years that there's more of a tendency to have burial services, graveside services? I just unfortunately gone to many funerals in the last years, even pre-COVID, because I understand during COVID that was pretty much the only option at times. But have people been tending to do more graveside burials as opposed to in funeral homes or synagogues?
So it's kind of a difficult, it's really hard to say an exact yes or no on this. I will say that I very rarely, if ever, see any funerals at the funeral home in Judaism. And again, it's families elect to go to the synagogue. And you think about, where would you rather go, to say goodbye to your loved one? Would you rather go to your home, the synagogue that you pray at, that you belong to, that your family and extended family are comfortable in, or a funeral home? I don't know very many people that would prefer to use my chapel versus going to the synagogue. I tend to see different levels of Judaism on to answer that question in that way. The Orthodox families, Chabad families, tend to go straight graveside. We don't do services in the Orthodox synagogues for different levels of beliefs, and I won't open that can of worms either. That's another topic. But conservative reform, it's becoming most likely, more often than not, we're having the service at the synagogue followed by graveside. And Avi can probably answer that as well, because Avi is the ritual director at Sheretz Israel, and so he sees that as well. And sometimes it goes depending on the weather. If it's a beautiful day, it's supposed to be nice outside, oftentimes families will elect to just do a graveside service because it's going to be, the weather's going to be nice, and maybe they have a section out in Dolphin Road that's underneath a tree and it's really beautiful and pleasant. So those factors play into that
She just
as
said,
well.
as long as there's no squirrels.
As long as there's no squirrels and no
She wanted me to
mosquitoes,
say that.
then we do that. And these are things that, as far as the planning process is concerned, because we have these discussions, and that's part of what we encourage families to fill out. We have various guides, like we have a resource guide here.
They're in the hallway.
That really walks through Jewish 101 as far as burial is concerned, different beliefs and traditions. And there's also a section back here for you to fill out and answer questions such as, would you like the Chaver Kadisha to come and do a ritual Tahara? Would you like a shomer? Would you like your family to be the shomer? Which I think is amazing. And that's, I encourage that as much as possible. If family members can come and sit. If you ever come to our funeral home, I have basically an apartment for our shomer. Full bathroom, kitchen, bedroom, everything. So, it's a nice welcoming facility. I designed it. Actually, had the help of a couple rabbis and members of the Chaver Kadisha help me design the layout of the funeral home. So we made it more homely feeling than a funeral home feel. And a lot of it's for that purpose because it's occupied 24/7 oftentimes because we have a shomer there. But this book is I'm going to give one to everyone that's here, and one of the questions is whether you want to have graveside service or you'd like to have it at the synagogue. Those are things that you definitely want to discuss with your family members.
Just wait till the end, pass them out. On behalf of the Dallas Jewish Historical Society, I want to tell a little bit about our story with our oral histories. The thing I hear most commonly after someone dies, when we hear about it, and if we have an oral history, we post it on our Facebook page, their oral history, their video. Sometimes people find it at random. I've had people say, I was just surfing the internet and I typed in my father's name and this video came up from the Dallas Jewish Historical Society. But the most common thing I hear, whether people watch it after someone dies or even before, is my parents never told us that story. Doing these questions, doing these videos gives you the opportunity to tell stories that you might not have had an occasion to tell. Or you might have told it 100 times and your kids think, oh my God, he's going to tell that story again about getting stopped by the policeman because you ran into a cow. Sorry, that's my story. I wasn't driving that time. And our memories, we've got our heads full of so much stuff these days. And we all know that we're having those senior moments. But even if it's a story that you've told your kids about your family, about where you came from, your grandchildren won't have heard it, your great-grandchildren won't have heard it, unless your children find a way to pass it down. So if you capture it, whether it's in a book or on a video, whatever it might be, it's a gift. It's really a gift to your children and your grandchildren, and it lasts forever. So I would encourage you to follow the examples of people who have already done it or who are working on it, and we certainly encourage coming to us and getting your name on the list to do an oral history video. It takes 30 minutes or so. We send the questions out ahead of time. You can come in and talk about what you want. You don't have to answer the questions necessarily. And it makes it a nice gift to leave behind, or even to share with your children. We had one person who watched it with her daughter, and her daughter said, I had no idea that your work with the chorus has meant so much to you all these years. But by watching your face, I can see how important this was to you. So get in there and do it. That's my plug.
And I can say as like younger with parents that have passed, like what our kid's great grandmother was Rosie the Riveter. She worked on the railroad telegraph, and at the time, I mean, this was before digital recordings and stuff, and I always thought, gosh, I should bring in a tape recorder and record her story, and I never did. And she passed, and when the kids were little, so yeah, I can tell them about her, but they're not going to get feisty Dorothy, like talking in her own words about her journey from upstate New York to Arizona. So I can't stress for everyone like how really important and meaningful it is for children and grandchildren and whatnot, like to be able to just go in and hear those words and your voice and stories and everything. It really is.
And you know what? All you need is a phone.
Yeah, we especially during the pandemic, we transitioned to being able to do them over Zoom. We do have people who want to keep their stories off the internet, which we are able to do. We just, they live in our vault and are just preserved for your family. If your family wants a copy or just wants to come in and listen to them in our office, there's that option too. The same with keeping memorabilia and whatnot, right? Like everybody's like, oh, my kids don't want my stuff. Well, here we are. We create family collections and business collections and whatnot, and all of that is saved for, the future generations and as part of
And we also give people who say, I can't believe my mother saved all this. And we do go through it. Sometimes we weed things out, but not always. I want to thank our speakers. Thank you, Avi. Zane. And we're right down the hall on the other side of Zale. If you get the urge to come in and check us out, sign up for oral history, or just want to visit. Thank you.